Government agencies are increasingly using AI to augment systems in national security and intelligence capacities. Today on GovCast, we'll talk about the complexities of AI implementation and the robust governance frameworks needed to ensure safe execution. Joining me on today's show is William MacMillan, former CIA Chief Information Security Officer and current Chief Product Officer at Andesite AI. Thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ross. Glad to be here.
So let's talk about opportunities. What are the big opportunities for AI to enhance efficacy and efficiency? Obviously, now with the administration focusing on that in the public sector, particularly in the IC, cybersecurity more generally, and all that ties that together.
Yeah, sure. Well, I think you nailed the starting point in your question, right? Efficiency and accuracy or quality, I think are two very important things that AI can inject into the equation. My particular area of interest is human in the loop AI, and I think the degree to which AI can help humans scale across the vast amounts of data that they're trying to deal with nowadays is really key. And so you can, double click on that and break that down into a whole bunch of different areas. You asked about the intelligence world and cyber, and so those are both great topics that we can go into as much depth on as you want. At a very high level, I would say, in the intelligence world, something that makes that use case really, really interesting is the stakes and the potential implications of mistakes being made and preserving human agency, human decision making. And then cyber, very, very similar story that, be great to get into with you today.
Let's dig right in. The intelligence community, certainly the error rate, it has to be as low to zero or as close to zero as possible. So I know, speaking to defense officials and IC officials, the notion of human in the loop really does matter because of the hallucinations and things like that. That could bump against efficiency, because I know a lot of the efficiency push can be for um, taking humans out of the loop because humans are expensive. Software is not as expensive. So I know this is a long walk to how do you square that? How do you keep the humans in the loop and keep costs down in such a critical situation?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's back up a little bit and just talk about, the use of AI in government. I think it's really important for people to think about the relationship that citizens have with these government agencies, right? So, the people who give the consent to be governed have a special relationship with these agencies. They don't frequently know what they're doing, at least not in specific detail, because of the need to protect sources and methods. And so it becomes really important that they establish a relationship of trust, right? So unlike in the private sector, where if your telecommunications provider gets hacked and you're mad about it, you can switch. You don't get to switch if you feel like your government is not being careful enough with your information or not delivering accurate results, right? There's a special obligation there for government folks. So I think I happen to believe in human in the loop AI across the board for the most part, with maybe some exceptions. But I think in government, it's even more important because you want to know that you have that human accountability for the decisions that are being made, and you got into a little bit in your question about sort of accuracy and, the tolerance for making wrong conclusions is extremely low. What's interesting about some of the systems that are coming online nowadays is that everybody knows that, data analytics at scale is a real problem, but the volume is a problem too that I think we don't talk about often enough. So the way I think of AI in these high stakes, really can't fail, low risk tolerance workflows, decision-making scenarios, is that you've got to provide the insight that matters to the human decision maker, before they even know they need it, right? Like ideally, the moment before they have a question that they want to answer, that insight is popping up, and we can use these AI systems to comb all of these disparate data sets that folks are buried in nowadays and proactively surface that insight and that context for them. I think that's really the key.
The difficulty of that, I imagine, is fairly high because you are kind of trying to create out of the unknown. How can AI do that?
Yeah, well, I mean, it can be super tricky in the government domain, especially in the intelligence community, where you have different data sets at different classification levels, sometimes, across different agencies. And so using AI carefully to be able to look across those data sets is an area that you have to pay a lot of attention to, right? These systems have to be architected in a really responsible way where, the users of these systems and ultimately the constituents or the customers that are the downstream beneficiaries of these systems, they have to have assurance that the data flows are understood, that, you're not, God forbid, like accidentally using sensitive data to train models and it's going to pop up elsewhere. So there's really an entire science and discipline involved with architecting these systems in a responsible way, especially when we talk about Gen AI, which is a generative AI, which is a little bit of a different beast, right? Because it's got the ability to apply some almost human-like reasoning across these data sets. So we just need to be super careful with how we set them up to begin with.
This sounds a lot like governance. Like how can agencies, particularly again in the national security and intelligence world, set up governance that both keeps the guardrails in now and sets up future ones for problems that again we may not know about?
Yeah, great question. There's a little bit of a bootstrapping problem here. When I talk to my friends and former colleagues that are still in government roles, there's a little bit of anxiety about the fact that we need to set up governance regimes for these systems, but they haven't been out there in the world for long enough for people to build up the expertise with them to really know how to govern them effectively, right? So we find ourselves in a situation where, people are doing the best they can with sort of, voluntary guidelines that they're applying as they procure these systems. I have a talk track when people ask me, what should I be looking for in AI for cybersecurity systems? And there's three, four, five things that I think are, just must have fundamentals if you're going to employ one of these systems in sensitive capacities like cybersecurity.
On the risk side of things, I know you had touched on using sensitive data for training models and stuff. But what are some of the more broad risks? Because we have talked about possibilities. What are the sort of broad risks that you see um, in AI in those applications? And just because we just talked about it, Gen AI particularly.
Yeah, so the first one that I'll focus on, and we already alluded to it once, is kind of what I'll call architectural risk. These Gen AI systems, what's happening in a lot of enterprise environments is you'll have scenarios where an enterprise provider is providing like LLM as a service, right? And so people building systems that need to rely upon a large language model, one of these pre-trained models that we're using nowadays, they may be relying on an outside office or an outside function to be able to go to that LLM and service the requirements of that system that they're building or that they're procuring and implementing. And you have to be super careful in scenarios like that, that you've agreed upon certain security guidelines, data authorization, data boundaries that you've pre-authorized, and that you understand how you're using that LLM. I'll give you a really silly example to just kind of, for dramatic effect. You wouldn't want to build a national security system that relies upon an LLM and then, leverage some sort of free commercial, internet facing LLM provider, right? You're going to want to use an LLM that's in some sort of, protected boundary within some sort of contained environment. And there are a lot of different scenarios, but you have to go into it with people who understand from sort of the architectural perspective how to design those systems so that they're safe and secure. And then beyond the architectural perspective, the constituent components of AI have different risks, right? So let's start by saying AI is a how, it's not a what or a why, right? So you're not often buying a system that's just a generative AI model or just some machine learning. You're frequently combining these things. And so you have to look at the risks of these different constituent parts. So a very well-known pitfall of generative AI models is the hallucination, right? This is a pretty widely understood risk that large language models can do and say very strange things if you don't build guardrails around them. So that's the approach that we take with that component. With something like ML, machine learning, that is maybe more based on large amounts of data flowing through a system, you need to be careful there that you understand sort of the algorithm and how the decisions are being made by that model. So black box AI is a problem that we're increasingly focused on and trying to guard against. So just some examples about how you have to look at the different types of technology that are built into your system.
The constituent components, obviously there's a lot of stuff coming in, and the phrase that I've heard a lot, of course, is system of systems. Making those work in AI is particularly difficult, and again, makes it even harder with sensitive data. How do you make that work?
Carefully. You've got one of the things that I find myself, I specialize in cybersecurity. And so I interact a lot with chief information security officers, CISOs. And one of the things I end up finding myself telling them is, look, this is not a situation where you want to buy the cheapest product out there, right? I mean, you don't want some hastily assembled chat body system that is like, just a co-pilot type thing on top of a bunch of sensitive data. Going back to that sort of architectural approach, you want to make sure that you're buying a product from a team or you're building something according to design patterns, if you happen to be building your own, where you're abiding by these principles. I'll give you an example of one of the principles that we use a lot in my line of work. We talk about what we call evidentiary AI. Evidentiary AI is the idea that your AI should be articulating in fine-grained detail what it's seeing, recommending, doing on your behalf at all times in a way that can be understood by humans using the system to build their confidence that the system is doing things the way that a human expert would do it, right? This makes sense. So this is particularly important with generative AI models that, like we said, can do some pretty strange things if they're not built properly. So evidentiary AI is something I consider to be a principle of AI systems that anybody developing or buying one should abide by as they're looking to implement one of these solutions.
The analogy of the good guys and the bad guys using AI is, that's not really even an analogy, but the situation of the good guys and the bad guys uh, using AI is one of this arms race. So for cybersecurity purposes, again, I know I keep going to this well, but how do you solve those problems that don't exist that are because AI is evolving so very quickly?
Yeah, what's interesting about this particular moment in time in cybersecurity is that for once, we find ourselves in a situation where the general consensus is that AI really stands to benefit the defenders, really like sort of really help them catch up to where the bad guys have been for a while, right? People have been getting attacked in cyberspace at internet scale and machine speed for a long time. We finally now have these systems that are helping deal with that scale and volume. And Gen AI in particular is really good at helping deal with the volume problem. So if you think about a cybersecurity, what we call SOCs, a Security Operations Center, SOC, if you think about these incredibly talented people, these rows of workstations and people monitoring their networks to see if the bad guys are trying to get in, they have for a long time, very famously, this is a widely studied problem, been subjected to something we call alert fatigue, right? Which is just too much data coming in, too many, chimes going off and flashing lights, and they can't sort through all the data, right? And we tried for a long time in the cybersecurity space to develop these ML-based systems to reduce that alert fatigue. Gen AI actually flips the script on all of that. And suddenly we find ourselves in a situation where these newer systems can actually take advantage of all that data, all of those alerts to make sense of what's going on. At the same time, they abstract the humans out of the sort of torture and pain associated with that data deluge. So you actually want all those alerts with these newer systems, but you don't want them all landing in your analyst queue in a way where they have to deal with them. You want them already sort of investigated and packaged and bundled and some sort of analytic insight provided to the analyst. So you can simultaneously solve that alert fatigue problem and also increase accuracy by using these systems. So that's what's super, super exciting about this current moment in cybersecurity history. There is, however, a footnote to this very optimistic talk track, which is that I think we all are cynical enough, if we've been in cybersecurity for long enough, to realize that the bad guys are going to catch up, and we're going to move beyond this world where we see really good phishing emails because of generative AI, and the business email compromise, this idea of of cloning someone's voice and calling them with a really, really persuasive voice call that sounds like your boss telling you to, transfer money out of an account or whatever. That's like the state of the art of the threats right now that we're seeing out in the wild, but we all know that it's going to get a lot worse. So it's super important for cyber teams that haven't already kind of taken the leap to get involved in this space and really study some of these new systems that are coming online, so they have them in place and they're good at using them before the bad guys really take that next step.
To use the good guy, bad guy analogy and tie governance into it on both the cybersecurity and more broader fronts. How important is leadership of America and its allies in developing sort of international standards and being the pace car for AI development?
Well, it's incredibly important. It's critical, but it's also tricky, right? So one of the things we say a lot is that the bad guys are unconstrained by the legal and ethical concerns that we're constrained by. And so this brings us into the space of, you mentioned, sort of guidelines and standards, but we also have to talk about norms of behavior. And, try as we might, we really, as a world, haven't gotten to the point yet where there are inviolable norms, limits, red lines that people won't cross when it comes to cyber. I think it's super important. The frameworks, the international standards, the agreed upon governance regimes, those are extremely important. They're critical. But we also really need to up our game on this conversation about cyber norms, so that we aren't thinking through this in extremis when something really terrible happens because some adversarial nation state that doesn't really care about the same ethical guidelines that we do does something that we would view as shocking, but within their worldview, it's a perfectly normal thing to do.
Yeah, the great power competition does certainly bleed into this a lot. I want to shift a little bit because we did start talking about humans in the loop so much. Training and familiarity with the tools, particularly on the cybersecurity front. But again, this is sort of an umbrella thing for all AI applications. How do you make sure people are up to date again with these tools that are so new?
Yeah, well, what's really cool, if you do it right, is you can build these tools in a way where they pull the people along, right? So again, you don't want to be in the market for the cheapest, quickest thing because you're under budget pressure to like spend some money on AI, right? You really want to apply these principles. And another example of a principle that I think is germane to your question is, human AI collaboration at the core of the workflows, I think is extremely important, right? We're very loose with terminology like autonomous AI, autonomous systems. There's always an end to those workflows. There's always a point at which a human being is involved, and the human and the AI are collaborating in some way. If you pull them both into the exact same workflow space, you can create a situation where the humans and the AI are both teaching and learning from one another. And that gets really interesting when you have a human who maybe doesn't quite understand what's happening or doesn't have the skill to take the next step, but the AI can actually pull them along and teach them what needs to be done next. I think that's a really exciting frontier in the development of these systems, and something that's going to get really interesting over the next couple of years.
On that note, put on your crystal ball gear. What does that development look like for particularly for government?
What I think is likely to happen in terms of government adoption of AI is, if you tackle workflows that have historically been done by lots of people, right? There are some shared characteristics of those scenarios. So, very manual processing of, a bunch of paperwork, right? For example, a lot of times you will have these large numbers of people, and they're also sometimes not trained on really advanced technology. So you're going to be simultaneously sort of attacking this from both ends. You're probably going to be increasing the efficiency of those humans, right? I don't want to talk about people losing their jobs, but over time, you're going to be doing more work with fewer people. That's just a reality. We see that all playing out in the news right now. That's where people are going when they say efficiency. So you're going to be looking for those opportunities for the AI and the humans to play to their respective strengths, which means the drudge work, the digging up, the turning over rocks looking for clues, all of that can be done by AI, and then that context can be brought to the humans. At the same time, those humans need to be trained on this capability that we're putting in their hands in order to enable them to do more work with fewer people. And that's where I think, this whole idea of having the humans and the AI teach and learn from one another comes in. And the AI can be very good, if you build it correctly, at explaining what it's doing and how to look at a certain type of problem. And the humans using it can learn in workflow, right? Like you don't have to send them off to some 6-week camp to learn how to use the AI. The AI, in a very collaborative way, can sort of explain what's happening and what it's seeing and doing and recommending, and teach the person along the way. And AI, as you can tell, I am a techno optimist, and I'm super excited about the AI that we're bringing online for cybersecurity. But one of the things, and I think this holds true for other domains, right? I'm just speaking about the cyber domain because that's what I know best. It's really incredibly important to be prepared to implement the AI and to really nail the basics before you do that. You don't want to start automating and accelerating processes that aren't already, maybe not optimized, but at least fundamentally very effective, right? Like buying an AI, let's throw an AI at this situation, this dysfunctional work unit or something, is not a path to success. You really want to think about preparing your organization in terms of, training and education, in terms of the technology that's in place to be able to adopt AI effectively in a way that really leads to accurate, efficient, effective human AI collaboration in those different environments. So, if you're not already nailing the basics, if you're if you're running a cybersecurity team in an enterprise environment and you don't have all the things, multi-factor authentication and the proper encryption and all those things, you're not going to want to put AI on top of that. You're going to want to address some of those basics first.
Yeah, certainly the bedrock of these kinds of things is way more important than just putting a hat on it. The archaeology thing that was explained to me by Jen Polk about, in public sector systems is always that has rewired my mind as to how these things happen. You do not want to be just piling on top of each other. Certainly in this new AI world, I think that's key to understand.
Absolutely.
Thanks so much for doing this.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ross. It was a lot of fun. I appreciate it.